Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that is going to go viral on Twitch after it starts playing Among Us. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I don't know if you caught that. Did you catch? We're not going to cover this in our later news by the looks of it, but AOC didn't break Twitch, but I think she got something like nearly 500,000 Twitch watchers when she decided to go play Among Us.
It was pretty good. There's some pretty good memes around it. She gasped a lot. I don't know if you also follow H-Bomber Guy on YouTube?
Yes, I do. I saw that as well. I suppose we should just throw in the tweet into the show notes for people.
He did a great betrayal, basically. I think he said he caused an international incident by killing AOC, who's right next to her. You know, that's the game. But yeah, it was a lot of fun, and I think it's been commented on that it's weird to think now, but this might become, I'm going to say new normal again, maybe not a new normal, but it's something that we can maybe expect in future elections. There'll be more and more people who grew up as gamers in that sense, or there might be more politicians who might try Twitch as a way of getting out the vote, and that's kind of what that whole Twitch stream was about, wasn't it? It was about, I think it was paired with the, Ambition, the website that tries to get out the vote and encourage young people to just vote in 2020. Doesn't really come with a particular political agenda. Nobody was saying vote Democrat or vote Republican. It's just the message, get out and vote, which seems to have been pressed particularly hard this year because turnout it's important in all elections, but it's particularly important in US elections where I think there are a lot of barriers to actually going and voting. In some states you have to register a lot in advance, or we've seen from the news like long queue lines. So even encouraging people that their vote matters and you really should go that extra mile and wait in that queue for 11 hours maybe just to cast your vote, it's a really important message.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll touch on it a bit more when we go into our quick polls update, but it is wild to me to see the kind of threads about how you're going to have to queue for 11 hours, bring snacks, bring a phone charger or a battery pack. And it's just like, here I walk in and I go, hi, I'm me, this is my address. And they're like, yeah, go over there, sign yourself in a booth, and it's never a problem. And it's such a different experience. Obviously, there are more people in the US, but also they're more spread out. So I think maybe we can touch on it when we come to polling later. But I think we should barrel on with our headlines. So our first headline is So Cruel from the Mirror.
Yeah, this is the story that last night, or on Wednesday the 21st, Conservative MPs basically voted down a measure by Labour that would have guaranteed free school meals to students outside of term time and basically through Christmas and into Easter. This has been a campaign that's been championed by Marcus Rashford, the Manchester United striker, on Twitter. He has been successful in forcing one government U-turn on this issue earlier in the year. However, that support was running out and he was pushing for that to be extended, particularly as the COVID crisis continues and looks like it will rumble on for a little while yet. This second attempt had quite a pushback from Conservative MPs who their defence was that there were already measures in place or there were other support systems that they could use without having to rely on this. But it does seem to have fallen on deaf ears somewhat, with even the empathy vacuum, which is Nigel Farage coming out and saying, I think we probably should have helped pay for those kids' school meals on Twitter. So this headline in particular from the Mirror, if you get to see the image, it's got the names of all the Conservative MPs who voted against the measure to extend free school meals to children. So yeah, it's particularly poignant and maybe shows that the government tactic of giving Marcus Rashford an OBE and hoping he'd go away didn't work. Yeah. So this is one of those stories where I don't know what the intersection is on my. I think we've talked before about social media bubbles, but there is kind of the friend of a friend effect. And like when we had Brexit, there were certain groups on Facebook where if I went into them, I could definitely come across people who did not agree with my stance, which was Brexit bad. But generally it would be in these kind of further away places. It's interesting that this is like, I've seen, maybe it's just because I've maybe expanded my Facebook groups a bit more, or maybe I've, there's some friends of friends I didn't see before because of the algorithm. I don't know why I've seen more of this story than others. Maybe it's just because more of my friends are talking about it. But it's interesting seeing people try and defend we shouldn't pay for schools for teaching. It's not for giving out free meals, and it's like, but yeah, like
there are so many reasons why giving school meals to children are important. It's important for kids to have at least, they should be having 3 square meals a day, as people say, because, they're growing minds, growing kids. But at the very least, if you can offer them 1 meal, regardless of their parents' circumstances, that definitely helps with cognition. If you're tired and hungry all the time, you can't pay attention to what you're learning in school. And obviously, if you come from a more disadvantaged background, that's all compounding. And this is very much that kind of systemic problems that I think people have been trying to face this year worldwide. So it's like, this disproportionately affects people who aren't rich and white. Or in fairness, it doesn't even, it's the same thing. It's systemic, where more white people are rich and therefore can afford to just pay for their school lunches or whatever, or have better food at home. So yeah, it covers all of that kind of area that we've touched on several times over the summer. And it's very hard to read. Like, I really struggle to read these people trying to defend it, basically, because when you look at the overall cost of what this would cost, I think it was for the rest of the year someone had costed it, and you compare it to the money the government has thrown away on various things in the pandemic that haven't worked. And that's we're not even talking about the massive Serco contract, which is in the billions. But, I think that there was a lot of comparison. Maybe we're going to get onto it a bit later as we start to talk about where things are going with these new lockdowns and changing tier system. But, the government is quibbling over regions in less than 100 million when they're talking to local governments, and also for things like this, it's a few hundred million, and then you compare it to how much they spent on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, and I think a lot of people are drawing very unfavourable comparisons there for the government.
Precisely, and I mean, I don't think it's cruel of me to say that there's no more sympathetic group than starving children. Like, an easy political win is, we should probably help those people out. Like, I don't see how it's overtly political in a way, or how you can pick a side when it's just saying there are children that don't eat enough food, we should probably support them. To me, that seems like just a basic human right, and you should probably help do that. The fact that the government, it's a very hard argument to try and argue against that, and some of the hoops they try to jump through, I think it's clearly not striking a chord with the general public. You can't take social media as a whole, but the number of likes Marcus Rashford post got, with, thousands, hundreds of thousands of likes for his campaign, compared with the statement made by the Department of Work and Pensions that I saw this morning, it literally had 5 likes, and you're like, obviously Marcus Rashford has a lot more pull than the Department of Work and Pensions on Twitter, but equally the fact that nobody's even seeing that reply under it and going, oh yeah, I'm going to like that to try and be a contrarian. Like, nobody's even doing that. It's just it's an odd decision for the government. They already U-turned on it once, because I think they saw how potentially, what a loss it appears to them to do. It's definitely going to lose them some political capital. And to do it again is, not a good look for the Conservative government.
Yeah, I think the one thing is, this is one of those things where it's, as you say, it's the general public. I mean, I think it's very easy to sway the general public on the concept of starving children should be fed in the UK. I know there's problems when we talk about aid internationally, and that's a whole different thing. But I think in general, you talk to someone about it, look, there are starving kids. Most people, as you say, would be like, yeah, we should feed them. But this is very much one of those ideological things for conservatism, where it's, small government, the government shouldn't be intervening, it's pull yourself up by your bootstraps, all that kind of stuff. So I think that's why you probably see more people arguing for it across. And it's also, it's one of those traditional kind of conservative points, I think. So it's like, there are people who might not agree with Brexit, for example, who would be the kind of conservative who might still back this idea because that's what they've always backed, for example. So our next headline is from the Daily Mail: Archbishop's assault on the Brexit bill.
This is the news that, that internal markets bill that we talked about a few weeks ago. It has passed through Parliament, but we've got to remember there is another chamber it's got to go through, the Lords, and in particular that has not only members from, political parties such as Labour, Conservatives, Lib Dems, etc. It also has bishops on there because, I don't know, they've got to go somewhere, haven't they?
The Lord's spiritual, as I enjoy telling American friends who are like, why do you have such an archaic form of government?
Yes, precisely. It does
feel basically to anyone else who is not in the UK, it's like, oh yes, we have the Lord's temporal and the Lord's spiritual, and you generally lose people there. And then you explain that some of those are hereditary peers, like something like 90 of them are still hereditary peers, despite the fact we had a law to change all that. And yeah, it's not a rabbit hole we can go down now, but the House of Lords is an interesting institution.
Yes. But the fact that it took the Archbishop to kind of say, hey, the Church's stance on this Brexit bill is that it is wrong to break international law, made a few people raise their eyebrows and say, is Boris Johnson trying to defy God by putting this bill through? That might be a bit strong, sorry, they're my words, but still that there are battle lines being drawn between church and state on issues of Brexit, is concerning. And I just wanted to use that as a point to kind of jump in to say, it's not the only Brexit story that we've had in the past couple of days. In particular, over the last few weeks, there has been renewed rhetoric, particularly around a no deal from both sides. There was a very important EU conference where Macron essentially said that France wouldn't budge on its fishing rights, and that is seen as a big sticking point for the UK in their negotiations. And that Boris turned around on Friday and said, look, negotiations are off unless the EU moves. Weirdly, the markets didn't move when he said that, which suggests to me, or a lot of people were saying, it was just pure saber rattling. And we've had this before, right? Where Boris says, no, definitely no deadline. The deadline has passed. We're going to do a no deal. And then nothing happens. And then they talk anyway. This is about the third or fourth time it's happened. And similarly, those in Europe seem to not be taking it seriously. So much, in fact, that about an hour after his press conference, another person had to be sent out to the media to kind of say, no, we really mean it this time. And I don't know how much sort of television or radio you listen to, but there has been a marked step up, I would say, in the get ready for Brexit adverts that have been going around. I think it's
interesting, actually, because I think I've touched on this before. Like certain podcasts do ad insertion, which is automated and based on your location. And I was getting a lot of those get ready for Brexit adverts previously, and I haven't noticed an uptick in them yet. But it's generally things like Intelligence Squared, things like that are, more expensive podcasts than ourselves, who have these kind of ad insertion services. And I've noted it before, because when I've been on a VPN, I've got unintelligible adverts in Flemish or Finnish. So I haven't noticed that myself. I have just noticed the kind of repeated story of Boris saying, oh, we're going to totally have a no deal. And to the point where some friends are like, oh no, it's definitely happening now. And I'm like, well, it didn't happen the last 6 times. I'm going to, at this point, if I see that story, until it's like we have been kicked out on our ear by the EU, I'm not going to accept that it's true.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, we should take it more seriously, just because this is the first time where the previous times we've had it, we've always been able to move the deadline. When we officially left the EU earlier this year, as part of the withdrawal agreement, that kind of set the clock ticking for roughly a year, or the end of this year, to get a deal done. And it's very unlikely that Boris Johnson will come back to the EU cap in hand asking for an extension, because I think that would be a political humiliation. So it really is. They do have until, December 31st to iron everything out, but more realistically, they're going to have to do it by November, end of October time. We are right at the end game here to try and get some form of deal between us and the UK. Talking about deals, I would just like to touch on the fact that, the Prime Minister has been proposing an Australia-style deal. For me, he might as well be saying Afghanistan deal, because it's exactly the same deal. It's basically no deal, but by another name. But I think by saying Australia, it makes people think, oh, Australia's quite nice. I could live like Australia, rather than anywhere else that doesn't have a deal with the EU. So there is a bit of semantics being played by the government here. Again, as I've previously said, I think this is a lot of saber rattling. I hope that we are able to get an agreement with the EU over some aspects of our economy, because I think it is undoubtedly true that it will be better if we're able to get a deal than if we are not, particularly the short-term economic consequences, particularly when you have to put that on top of all the extra, we're about to talk about it in the main story, but the implications of COVID and what that has done to business. Putting a no-deal Brexit on top of that, I think, would be particularly disastrous. And that's not just me saying it. Michael Gove and Boris Johnson had a meeting with over 200 business leaders this week, which was, by the reports in the Financial Times, particularly not well received by those participating. One said it went down like a bucket of cold sick. And even though Michael...
That's a particular mental image.
Yes. And even though Michael Gove was sort of saying to them, it's like moving house. It's a hassle at first, but it'll be worth it in the long run. That didn't seem to put businesses' minds at ease. And one of the participants said that Boris Johnson was there for about 15 minutes, but then left, making them feel it was a bit of a box-ticking exercise and that, just so Boris could appear in the Commons and say, yes, we've talked to business. But maybe not necessarily got their approval. So, I think that's just a little reminder that, hey, through all of this, Brexit is still happening, and probably after the presidential election, that's where we'll want to turn our focus to as a country. I know it's been brought up a little bit with the Internal Markets Bill, but the actual meat and drink of what the UK and the EU will decide in a deal, if it comes to that, I think that's still up in the air on a lot of points.
Yeah. I don't think I really have much more to add on that other than, I agree with you. So any kind of deal is going to be better than going out with absolutely zero deal. Even if it's, not what we would have hoped for when we were talking, 2 years ago about having some kind of soft Brexit deal that has not transpired. But, having to not renegotiate every single part of our trade partnership with the EU would be nice.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So on to our final story tonight from The Guardian, which is going to kind of lead us into our main story. Wales orders firebreak lockdown and leaves England going it alone.
Yeah, I think this is one of the sort of... It was like an interesting political side story at the start, but now I think we're really starting to see the teeth and maybe the problems, or some, not problems maybe, but some of the issues that devolution can cause when it comes to managing a crisis like this. So, just a quick brief overview of devolution, because it's not something we discuss very much in the UK, and even if you're listening in the US, it's something that's quite hard to fathom. Not that we have the system of states, the federal states that we do in the US, but of course we are a country that's kind of divided into 4 nations. Let's start there. So we've got England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Under Tony Blair's New Labour back in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was a really big push to give these countries more powers to set their own rules over certain aspects. So in particular, you had the creation of the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly. The Northern Ireland Assembly kind of came about as a result of, even though Northern Ireland has been separate for longer and has its own set of issues, as we've talked about, particularly when we're talking about Brexit, all of those places got powers to manage certain aspects of their society, in particular health, which was one of those ones that was given thinking, hey, you can control how you spend money on health and, a few bits of how you, treat people, although largely it's probably going to come under the NHS bracket. This devolution has now expanded under the Conservatives to give more power to regions in England. So particularly under Cameron's government, there was a big push for metro mayors. Under Labour, you'd already had the creation of a London mayoral position, which was originally taken by Ken Livingstone and then our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, most famously. And I think that proved to a lot of people that if a city was able to have its own powers over, things like Transport for London is managed by Sadiq Khan at the moment, and aspects of its health control and local councils, etc. If you give more power to those local regions, then they're able to solve local problems far better than if everything is coming from Westminster. So that's kind of the idea behind devolution. And I just wanted to pinpoint that it isn't exclusively a Labour ideal. Although the Labour ideal was mostly focused on the National Assemblies, Conservatives have tried to stretch that out into more, local areas and bigger cities. In particular, let me just bring up the list of metro mayors that we have. I don't know if you remember, but usually during local council elections, it depends where you live really, but there was an extra referendum question put on ballot saying, would you like a metro mayor or not? And if people voted yes, next time they would decide to vote for a mayor.
being a Londoner, that's not a thing I experienced because we had a mayor before such a time as I could vote, so I never saw such a referendum. But yes.
Just running down the list here, London has a mayor and that's been established since the year 2000. But the rest of the mayors from Cambridgeshire, Greater Manchester, Liverpool, Northumberland, South Yorkshire, Tees Valley, the west of England and West Midlands all have only come into being since 2017. So they've all come in under the Conservatives. And of those new mayors, they're split 50-50, with 4 of them being Labour seats, particularly those in the north, Greater Manchester, Liverpool, Northumberland, etc. And those generally located in the south, a bit more like the west of England, West Midlands and Cambridgeshire, are all Conservative. They control, populations between about 700,000 to 2 million people. And yeah, like I said, the idea is to try and get more people, give people more, power over their local decision making. Sounds great in practice, but this has kind of caused a major headache for the government and has made it very easy to compare and contrast where the national government guidance might be going out of skew with local ones, or particularly in those devolved institutions, indicate where they're doing it better than the government or allows them to take a different strategy. Yeah, so I think I just quickly wanted to talk on Scotland and its COVID laws, because I think that's been the first place that people have really compared and contrasted the response between Nicola Sturgeon and Boris Johnson, particularly earlier in the pandemic, where it seemed that Scotland was maybe taking decisions, looking at what Westminster did and then applying them, but because they hadn't had the coronavirus come as quickly or swiftly as it spread in England, their measures seemed to be far more effective and they could start to pick and choose. Even now, whereas England has a 3-tier system, Scotland is thinking of introducing a 5-tier system into their groups. Details are due to be announced early November for that, so we don't have all the details, but the assumption is here that the 5-tier system will allow them to go a bit harder, a bit faster than what's happening in England and allow them to shut down more. Equally, in Wales, as we've picked up on in our main story, Wales have gone for a full fire break or an old-fashioned lockdown like we had at the start. So that means shutting everything down. Kids don't go to school. You only go out if you have to go to work, if you're in a key worker position, or to the shops once a week, I believe. No household mixing. It's the highest tier of lockdown that you can imagine, which also means that it's the most economically damaging as well, which is where you get this big... I think this is the main crux of the argument now, it appears, with the COVID restrictions, and I don't know if you'd agree with me, feel free to be devil's advocate here, but at the start of the pandemic, as far as I can see, we went into full lockdown because we didn't have a working test and trace system. We weren't sure where the infections were, and arguably, and I think a few people, scientists have pointed this out, we shut down too late. The virus had been allowed to spread. We were living our lives completely normally for quite a while before we enforced the complete lockdown. And then suddenly 2 weeks later, we saw the big spikes coming through and the consequences of our actions of having not locked down earlier. That is a very effective way of suppressing the virus, but also equally, it's the most economically damaging, right? Because you are shutting down off entire industries. Hospitality industries are shut down for a long time. And then, even as you come out of it, the restrictions that were put in place meant that it was very hard for those former hospitality industries, travel industries, etc., to try and get back on their feet again.
There's been a lot of talk, and I know we're going to go into it a bit more here, but there's that balance between preserve it, at one side of the argument you have preserve the economy at all costs, and at the other side you have preserve lives at all costs.
And I think it's fair to say there are several nuances in between there, isn't it, where people...
Oh, definitely. But I mean, if we take those as the two extreme positions, and then obviously because everything in real life has some nuance, there is always going to be a compromise between those two positions. Even a Conservative Party that's very pro-business and doesn't want to close anything down had to do a lockdown, which shows you how important saving lives is as well. So there is these are the kind of two ends of the spectrum on which there's this push and pull that we've had to deal with.
Yeah, and we're now in the phase in the middle where people are tinkering with the rules to try and either edge it more towards what we had when we were in full lockdown at the start, to what we kind of had, not what we had before with total normal, but how far can we edge it towards normal and still keep people safe. And because you've got these varying degrees, you've got these new arguments coming out about why you should, when I said there's an argument about preserving life, I think there was a study, or at least there was one of the front pages of the Metro recently, that said deaths from other non-COVID related conditions had seen a spike because people weren't getting treated for them, things like diabetes, cancer, etc. That is something that, is an unforeseen consequence when you lock down the hospitals to try and make sure that critical care beds are available for COVID patients. It means that those critical care beds aren't available for other patients that equally need the treatment. So how do you balance those two things? I mean, as a government, it's very hard. The answer is more beds and Nightingale hospitals if you can provide them. It's an extremely complex issue, and devolution is now being used in a way where it's almost like it's been discussed as a petri dish of people experimenting with each different type of lockdown and restrictions that you can put in place and seeing who comes out on top. Where discussion has been most focused this week in particular has been over England and Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and what happens when you move into Tier 3 and how you get out of it. So, as we mentioned, if you're a Patreon supporter and you saw the little waffle at the start, you'd have been privy to the conversation about what tiers me and Tom are in. So I'm currently in a Tier 1 area, which is kind of the de facto choice for England. Which is you've got the rule of 6 applying, which means that you can't socialise in groups larger than 6 people, whether indoors or outdoors. You can continue to go to work as possible. Businesses continue to open, and pubs and restaurants act as normal as possible, but they can only consume food and drink while seated, and they have to be closed between 10 p.m. and 5 a.m. Schools remain open, places of worship remains open, the weddings and funerals can go ahead but with restrictions on numbers of people, and exercise and sport can continue as long as they happens outdoors. So that's kind of the regular thing that's been happening for me. For me, that doesn't feel like a massive change from what was going on before. Maybe the biggest change there was the rule of 6 that we didn't really have over the summer, but that's been the blanket rule. Now, you, Tom, you said you've been moved to Tier 2. So what does Tier 2 add on top of kind of Tier 1?
So I think if you look at the actual guidance, it's something like 6 bullet points, but it boils down to the same as Tier 1, but effectively you can't meet up indoors with people who are not in your direct family or bubble. So it basically removes going out for meals with friends, things like that, going to someone else's house inside, but you can still do the outside stuff. So it's a bit like that period before the lockdown eased a bit, where you could go and meet up in people's gardens and whatever. And I think there's also the other points are things like you should try and limit what your travel is. And there's a bit of clarification about how if you're traveling from a higher tier area, you shouldn't go to a lower tier area and stay over and things like that. But basically, whatever tier you're in, you apply those rules to yourself wherever you go. And obviously, if you're in a lower tier, you shouldn't really visit and stay in a higher tier for a long period of time. But basically, it affects the people in the higher tier more. But fundamentally, the only real difference, as far as I can see, as far as it's affecting me, is that I just can't meet up with friends at a local cafe or restaurant if it's inside. So it's a bit annoying, especially as we're coming into winter. Obviously, you would not want to meet outside. I know some pubs around here have put up gazebos, but when it gets properly wintry, that's not going to be good enough for meeting up with people from outside your bubble. So it will probably have more of an effect as the weather gets colder.
Yeah, certainly. And unfortunately, as we go into winter, it is predicted that COVID cases will go up. So it's unlikely that you'll go out of Tier 2 soon. And then the one above that, which is the highest current level that we've got in England at the moment, is Tier 3, which adds on Tier 2 essentially by saying people are prohibited from socialising with anybody they do not live with or have not formed a support bubble with in any indoor venue, private garden, or outdoor hospitality venues. In particular, you've got pubs and bars that remained open under Tier 1 and Tier 2. Pubs can still remain open, but they can only serve alcohol as part of food, which kind of does kill some pubs, nightclubs, etc. They can't do that. Schools and universities still remain open. Places of worship remain open, but again, you're not allowed to mix households, and it's essentially far more restrictive on business. And also travelling outside of a very high alert. So being able to travel outside a Tier 3 area to a non-Tier 3 area is not allowed unless it's for something like work or care provisions. So Tier 3 is very high. It's not a complete lockdown. You're not forcing businesses to close in the same way that the national lockdown did. However, some businesses that have been struggling through this pandemic from the time it started feel that it effectively does close their business because the restrictions and the lack of socializing people can do effectively kills their business off. And this is where we've had the next problem for the government, which is what financial compensation do you give local leaders and local councils in order to manage their Tier 3, and what is a fair amount to give each region, particularly as the furlough scheme comes to an end at the end of October. Is that correct?
I think that is the case because there's been a lot of talk this week about what Rishi is going to be putting in. And I think it was today that he's announced extra support for businesses, but I haven't had a chance to read that story because I've been at work.
Yeah, no, it literally has broken today, that Rishi story. But yeah, there's a lot of things where businesses, particularly in those areas, are saying, oh my goodness, we're going into something that is akin to a national lockdown. It's not totally, but it is very much like that. And we won't have the same financial support as we did before that helped us get through that very tough period. So this is where you start to see the effects of directly elected mayors, and there has been, the one that has taken the spotlight this week has been Andy Burnham and the plight of Manchester, which has been subject to a lot of speculation, and maybe where I've seen the COVID fight get the most political, because this is a Conservative administration trying to enforce rules on a very strongly Labour-run area, and to have them disagree so much on, what compensation would be given, and to have, the Mayor, Andy Burnham, essentially saying, we would refuse to be put into Tier 3 if we don't get the financial compensation we deserve, and the government coming back and saying, well, actually, we'll force you to go into Tier 3 anyway, and we'll give you whatever money you're given. Does leave quite a, it makes things quite feisty between the two political parties, whereas before with national lockdown, I feel we had this sense of national unity, at least in a national political level, of we're all in this together and we'll do whatever we can to help support the government. As we know, the government's perceived handling of the COVID crisis has suffered some dents over the past few months with, maybe we can talk about it now. Like you mentioned earlier, the Serco contracts and track and trace. I believe that contract is 12 billion. I know that's the
there's multiple numbers. I think the total amount going to Serco over a period of time is 12 billion. But just track and chase so far is something like 35 million or something. So like when we were talking about the spreadsheets, I think it was incorrect to say that they spent 12 billion on Excel, but it still was 35 million, which, as we pointed out at the time, you could hire a very effective and good team to deal with that, as opposed to people who don't know how Excel works. I appreciate when you've got to do things on a deadline, problems happen, but it was very much sounds like they just picked the wrong person. And I think there's been a lot of criticism at the government over this because we've had various people put in charge of things that seem more like nepotistic appointments, or their mates being put into places and being put in charge of things. I think we mentioned Dido Harding on the last episode, who is the main example at the moment who's getting a lot of flack from the media. I think there's very much this feeling that, you will see a lot going on social media. 100 and something million to a company who had never made any PPE before to deliver PPE, and then they can't afford to give 65 million to Andy Burnham for Manchester. And there's a lot of this stuff going around. It does obviously help that I know a lot of people in Manchester, so I'm seeing a lot of this kind of, maybe if you don't know people in the north, you don't see these kind of memes being shared around, but I think it's probably got through onto the average bit of Twitter by now, just because this has been such a big story. And yeah, it very much is. There's a bit of North v South, and there's a bit of Conservative versus Labour, all wrapped up in this story, which makes it that kind of this perfect story to draw out these a mixture of old arguments and current arguments to see where things are going. I think that the only thing I want to add in before we get into the nitty gritty is there was a bit of confusion over numbers earlier in the week, because I think Lancashire got 22 million or something like that. I'm going to get confused around the numbers here as well. But basically, people were saying, oh, Lancashire got this much, Manchester should get this much. And there was a bit of dispute. And the point is that at the time, and I don't know if it's yet been agreed, Boris hadn't actually stated a figure. But obviously, he's told Andy Burnham, and it's not 65 million, which is what Andy Burnham wants. But there's a separate 22 million, which is happening regardless. But it's then the quibbling over extra money to support vulnerable people and support businesses. And I think the original thing I heard was that if you go into tier 3, you should get £3 per person, was what I originally heard. I don't know if that actually ended up being the case.
I think I heard it was up to like £8 a head. But still, the figures I heard were £8 a head, and then people were contrasting that with the £7,000 a day for a track and trace consultant that the Conservatives were willing to pay, and saying, do they feel that that's a good use of public money, etc., etc. So yeah, there has been this huge disparity in the amount of money that's been thrown around. In particular, what happened on Wednesday with negotiations was Andy Burnham and the wider Labour Council went in with a bid saying, we think we need 90 million to support Manchester through this crisis. There was a bit of toing and froing, and the government came back and forth until the number on the table from Andy Burnham was 65 million and the government's was 60 million. A deal was unable to be done, and then the news broke on Wednesday afternoon to scenes where Andy Burnham was getting the news off of the mobile phone, like the BBC News, rather than having been contacted directly by anyone, which kind of seemed to show there was a massive breakdown in communication and undermined the feeling that the government and Manchester were working together in good faith on this. If the government was just prepared to say whatever figure they wanted to the media and were not telling Andy Burnham what that figure was, that's clearly a problem, isn't it? You can't negotiate in good faith with somebody else if you feel they're going to go behind their back at any given opportunity. The final figure that was put down was 22 million, which was, obviously 40 million less than what the government had previously offered them. And for the sake of quibbling over 5 million, which I had a tweet earlier from David Schneider, which I think he did the maths for me, so I'll have to rely on his maths. He said that that is 0.024 of 12 billion or whatever that is. It's a very tiny percent of what that track and trace is. £5 million is obviously not nothing, but in the grand scheme of things, people felt that it wasn't really a figure worth destroying a deal for and leaving the people of Manchester with only 22 million. Now, it is worth pointing out that the government has since gone back on that. A day later, they said that the offer of 60 million was still on the table and would be paid to Greater Manchester regardless. But there was an evening there where it seemed that the government had severely, just mishandled the situation, particularly on the communication front, to leave people thinking that they would be... I'm trying to do the maths quickly in my head, but 22 million is far less than 65 million, isn't it? It's like nearly only a third, a third of the number that you want, to leave people thinking overnight that that's actually what they were getting, and it appeared to be sort of like a punishment for Manchester for not being able to come to a negotiation, when you're seen to be punishing your own people that you're meant to be trying to protect from COVID and get them through this hard time. It was just, again, not another great look for the government, in my opinion.
And I think this is maybe one of our lesser known threads that has gone through stories we've discussed over the years. But it is definitely true that the big bombastic headline is the thing that people remember more than the retraction. And I don't think, in the same way, you'd think, given how, places like the Daily Mail do this all the time, where they'll print some ridiculous, horrible story, they'll get told off, and they'll have to print a retraction on page 6 that no one ever really sees. And it feels like the government's doing the same thing, but, not to sell a bad message, but they do something really loudly and obviously, and then they go back on it, but it's too late. The damage has been done. People in Manchester are not going to remember the fact that oh no, the 60 million was still on the table, because they should have just said that. Like, Boris continually refused. That's one of the few press conferences I've watched all the way through. He kept refusing to put a number to it. And it would have been much easier for him to say, the 60 million is still on the table, we're quibbling over the bit over the top. And I can't understand, like, for someone who is all, like, his kind of political style is always like bluster and over-promising, you think he'd overpromise in that moment and then, like, retract it later. But he's done the opposite, which is very strange to me, given his political style. And yeah, I would not be surprised if the only thing people in Manchester remember is this incident, because I've put the link and it'll be in the show notes. Watch that Andy Burnham giving a press conference, and he receives it, as you say, on air. That's the thing that's like going to be indelibly in people's minds.
It's a Labour campaign advert in 4 years' time, isn't it? It affects there were lots of Game of Thrones memes going around before all this by calling Andy Burnham king in the north, bringing up that old north-south divide. Well, yeah, the North remembers is the thing that will happen with that £22 million figure. And again, it's from a place where we've said that Manchester is dominated by Labour, but it was part of that red wall that went more Conservative in the 2019 election. These are meant to be the people that the Conservatives want to hold on to if they want to get a majority in the future. By doing this, it appears to some anyway to be, a very bad politics for those in the North, for just, you've just won these people over. Now you seem to be undermining that trust. Those majorities up there, because they just switched to Conservative, are not the biggest. Some of them are wafer thin, and it won't take a lot of people to change their minds to go back to Labour, to cause a real headache for the government 4 years down the line. So, yeah, it was odd politics all round, and I think what really solidified it for me today is when Rishi Sunak came out with his new sort of measures to help people in Tier 2, in Tier 3, Andy Burnham tweeted and said, "Oh, this is great. If something like this was on the table when we were talking about it, we would have been far happier knowing that this support was available for the citizens of Manchester." And those conversations had to have been happening at the same time. It's not like Rishi's just, written this on the back of a napkin today and said, yeah, that'll do. The government and the negotiators must have known that some update to the Tier 2, Tier 3 support was in the works, but that they were unwilling to share that with Andy Burnham to try and belay any of those fears and say, right, we'll say this number today, but just be aware that it will change by Friday because this is when we want to do our big announcement. Or maybe they could have brought the announcement forward to try and placate Manchester. Though I just feel that there are so many opportunities where the government could have marked this up as a win. But once again, they kind of shot themselves in the foot with it. And it seems to become a big mess that, like you say, even if they retract it, the damage has already been done. And I'm not quite sure how they recover their image in the North, at least in the short term.
Yeah, I think just one thing to add is for our international listeners that I'm sure you've heard of Manchester because of various football clubs. But, we're talking about, with Manchester and Birmingham are the next biggest cities after London in England. And so it's like, you think for a government that's supposed to be pro-business and all of this, I think you've already touched on how much of a mishandling it's been. But yeah, it's not like some small place with a small mayor making a big fuss. It is, second and third biggest places being affected. I think I just want to put that in as a thing for people who are listening and might not understand the intricacies of local English politics. So that's one Labour person's fight with the government. Just moving on with that, what can you tell me about Keir Starmer? Keir Starmer.
Yeah, this is Labour leader Keir Starmer's idea of a fourth tier, maybe above Tier 3, which is this idea that Wales has put into practice, which is a fire break. Essentially, you go back to what we did at the start in March, where you lock everything down, nobody goes to school, etc. You only have those key workers, but you do it for a very short and limited period. In his case, he is proposing a 2 to 3 week lockdown. He tried to put this idea forward in the House of Commons, and his reasoning was thus. It was, look, if you want to do a firebreak lockdown, do it now. Do it by the end of this week, because half term is coming up. kids won't be going to school anyway, so it'll have the least disruption on their education. Also, I think we have a little bit of proof anyway from at the start that we know a national lockdown was effective at suppressing the virus. It did work and helped to bring, levels down. Nobody knew when it was too early to come out of that because, of course, there's always a 2-week lag on these things. But the theory behind it is that 2 to 3 weeks would be a long enough period of time to suppress the virus, but a short enough period of time that the economic damage, although severe for those 2 to 3 weeks, we'd be able to bounce back fairly quickly. He was comparing this with Boris's idea of Tier 3 lockdowns, which Keir seemed to label as lockdown by the back door. Essentially, places go into Tier 3, and although they're not completely locked down and children still go into schools, the economy chugs on at a very low rate, and maybe not necessarily does it help to bring the R rate down if you've still got people moving, and particularly children going to schools, and people going to work, other places where the virus can potentially spread. His direct question to Boris Johnson in PMQs was, can you tell me how an area comes out of Tier 3? And Boris Johnson kind of said, well, the R rate has to be below 1, but we think that we'll review it every 2 weeks, and then again, every 28 days, the situation will be reviewed again. So we're already looking at some Tier 3 places at least being in that situation for a month, and most likely, thinking about what we know about how the virus is predicted to spread over the Christmas period, these people might be in Tier 3 until January. So it might be 3 to 4 months they're in Tier 3, which will have a massive economic impact. And Keir Starmer argued that maybe the science says that it doesn't actually suppress the virus as much as you want. If you're in Tier 3 and the R rate is still 1 and it doesn't go beneath 1, but you're still having all these dreadful economic restrictions, then isn't that the worst of both worlds? You're just perpetually in a lockdown situation where the economy chugs along, but nobody can really escape it. So that's why he was promoting a lockdown. On the other side, Boris Johnson is saying, no, a lockdown is definitely economically damaging. We've seen what it did when we locked down for 6 weeks. We can't risk that again. We have to keep the economy going so people can still plan. The businesses that are going, they can continue going. I think the Conservatives are at least aware that sections like the hospitality sector will continue to struggle, but at least they can keep some of the economy chugging along in Tier 3, and they think overall that won't be as damaging as a national lockdown. And equally, they think that it will be, it will also have the effect of suppressing the virus. In a way, I agree with it. From a Conservative standpoint and the people they represent, it's very hard for Boris Johnson to convince somebody in deepest, darkest Cornwall, for example, where there's a very low population density, that a national lockdown is in their interest. Whereas in Labour constituencies where you've got places like Manchester that are in Tier 3 and already up, Manchester would far prefer to have a short, sharp lockdown and then get it over with in 2 to 3 weeks. So you've got two leaders here operating very different sort of like political agendas and having very different solutions to the virus, and both of them are trying to be Captain Hindsight in a sense, saying that my method works, no, mine doesn't. And the truth is, we'll only know the answer in a month, 2 months' time to see who's right there. I don't think the government has ruled out a national lockdown if the virus escalates again and we need to find something above Tier 3. But for the moment, the government line appears to be it would have to be quite severe before they put, the conditions that we had in March back under, put the rest of the population under those conditions once again.
Yeah, we know it's tricky, but yeah. If you could prevent everyone from mixing with other people for 2 to 3 weeks, you could probably completely stop the spread of the virus. But when I say that, you'd have to be like, people would leave like airlocks on their houses. People would literally need to not leave their house for 2 to 3 weeks. And that would literally stop the economy for 2 to 3 weeks, other than ordering like robots to deliver your food. So, it's not actually feasible, but like that would probably do it, given the infection profile and how long it takes to infect people. If you could lock everyone in an individual box for 3 weeks, that would work. But equally, that would also completely destroy the economy. So again, this is kind of coming back to that point I made earlier on, where there's two extremes, And with real life, you have to come to some kind of compromise in the middle. And we're quibbling about where that compromise is. And, I don't think we'll fully know until we're out the other side what would have been the perfect process. But I think, I feel like, I definitely feel like I side on the side of we need a bit more borrowing, a bit more support for people, and then have a bit more of a stricter lockdown. Because as I said, like tier 2, it's basically no real difference. Like it really doesn't feel different to me. And I think that's the problem, is that like they simplified things and then they said, oh, you've gone into this new tier, but it didn't stop a load of stuff. And I think that means that tier 2 is not really going to have an effect. And anyone who's in tier 2 is likely to progress up to tier 3. Tier 3 maybe is strong enough to have more of an effect. But we'll see. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my feeling at the moment.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's all we've got is feelings at the moment, isn't it, on these things? In a perfect world, if you're looking at a place where it's worked, a lot of people point to New Zealand as a success story, don't they, of where a lockdown was working. But I think the main reason that was so good is because they locked down hard and fast. They had a very small number of cases and locked the entire country down right at the beginning, which meant they were effectively able to eradicate the virus and open back up to normality, apart from, people coming in and out of the country. They're in a very unique situation.
They're also, it's an island nation, so are we, but they're a smaller population. They have a fair amount of natural resources as well, so that also helps. So it's not exactly comparing apples and apples.
It never is. Country-to-country comparisons are usually a bad idea when you're talking about COVID. I mean, people on the other side of the argument who say, we should follow the Sweden model where they did nothing. You're now getting Sweden putting in more and more restrictions to what they do. I know recently, they've said, right, it sounds mad for me to be saying this when you're comparing it to what England and the UK have been doing, but they've recently come out and said, hey, no more gatherings of 50 people in nightclubs. That's bad. And I'm like, 50 people in the same place? What are you doing? But I know Sweden's been like the darling of these kind of particular type of news stories, but it was very obvious that Sweden's approach was not working very well over the summer, let alone now. So yeah, I don't think it's a thing we should draw on. I think it got into the public consciousness. Oh, Sweden's doing it differently and they're fine. And it's like, yeah, it doesn't seem like, yeah, I mean, the young and healthy Swedes seem to be fine, but all the people who are getting hurt by this thing are still getting hurt by this thing in large numbers. So precisely. I think, COVID has always been slightly political, but it's getting to a stage now where it's at its most political. The Prime Minister's questions I watched this week was one where both sides seemed the furthest apart on their ideas to control the spread of the virus, and I don't think that's going away unless we see another national lockdown. Maybe that's the genius in. Maybe genius is too strong. I think maybe that's part of Keir's plan by what he's doing by suggesting a national lockdown. A national lockdown is very popular amongst people. A recent study that YouGov did 3 days ago suggested that 67% of people support stronger lockdown measures in a more national sense, which means that there are enough people concerned out there that they feel, yeah, we wouldn't mind locking down for a period of time. 2, if tier 3 is unable to stop the spread of the virus, a national lockdown probably is going to have to be the next step for the government. And then Keir can turn around and be, well, I'm not happy, but I feel I was right in saying that this was the right way to control it.
I'm not happy, but I'll have to go along with it. To refer to our previous episode and the day-to-day.
Yeah. Meanwhile, Boris, I can't see Boris steadfast having to, saying, no, we're not doing a national lockdown if cases really start to go out of control. I think that will suddenly become an incredibly unpopular place for him to stand if the numbers and the health service is overwhelmed and people are screaming for a stronger thing to help control the spread. He can't just say, no, we're going to stick in tier 3 indefinitely. I don't think that would be a great look for them. So, as with all these things, we'll wait and see. With COVID, it's always you have to wait and see 2 to 3 weeks to see what the real impact is on the curve and the number of cases and hospital admissions, etc. But yes, as we are now 2 people who work inside the NHS, I know from some experience that we are at least cranking up our preparations for there is always winter pressures, but I feel that this winter it will have the additional pressure of COVID to deal with, and we'll have to see how the NHS manages under that stress.
Yeah. And I think obviously, whatever happens, at least we'll still be able to talk to each other over the internet. Speaking of, I'm now going to throw in an advert for one of the other shows on our network. Good evening and welcome to the bar. Join Dr. Wilko as he investigates the histories of your favourite spirits and your favourite cocktails while mixing you a drink at the bar. The other bars may be closed, but a podcast bar will always remain open. And now we're back from that. It's time for a quick polls update. So once again, we're looking at the US because they don't have very long to go before a election. It's happening at the start of November. So I think we're going to first look at the Trump versus Biden popularity polls, who's going to vote for who. This is interesting because I had a bit of a peek 2 days ago and Biden had got up to 10.5%. He's now dropped to just being 9.8% ahead of Trump, but still maintaining that clear lead. It just does seem like there's a bit of a tendency. And we did say, because bearing in mind, I think in 2 weeks' time, we will have had the election, right? So we'll be doing presumably an analysis episode. Well, I mean, that assumes there are going to be delays in result counting, but we'll see. We'll see what the results are like before we have that episode. Yeah, there's a little bit of narrowing happening. It's not massive at this point, but we do know that as you approach election day, polls do tend to narrow a bit. A nearly 10% lead is still a pretty good lead.
Yeah, hell yeah. It's all these caveats and, oh my goodness, what happened in 2016 in the back of our minds. But as Nate Silver says, and listening to his podcast 538 with Model Talk, I like a lot because it does go into the stats of these things. Their model contains results of every election, including 2016. So they have tried to factor that in. There are always, of course, polling errors, but as it appears now, 9.85%, is that what you said? Let me just...
It's 9.8% at the moment.
Yes. 9.8% is still like more than a usual polling errors margin away for Biden. And particularly, I feel that the other news that was coming out from Nate Silver the other day was that even though that national polls appeared to be narrowing, maybe in some of those swing states, Biden was actually looking a little bit better than he was, or that might be things evening out. We are getting
I did just see someone discussing that with Kansas, where it looks like actually maybe it's a 15-point lead, but the polling in that state is less good than nationally. So, this is the problem with polls. It's all guesswork up until the actual vote.
Yes, precisely.
Very informed guesswork, but guesswork nonetheless, and we always have to remember that. So, yeah, I mean, I think we'll know hopefully by our next episode what's happened, and we'll go into that. There's two more things I want to draw your attention. Oh, sorry, did you have something? Sorry.
The only thing I was going to say is there's been a bit of talking over the past few weeks about like it's not over yet, and Trump still has a path to victory. And that is very much true. We've got the last debate that's happening tonight, and that's 2 weeks away. So if Biden was to have an absolutely disastrous debate, then that might narrow things up even more. I think the big problem for Trump is that he needs not just one thing to go his way, he needs several things to go his way, and for that momentum to be continuous over the next 2 weeks. Whereas with, last time in 2016, things were a lot more, the pendulum was swinging a hell of a lot more, and he only needed a couple of things really to knock Clinton off the path she was on. And time is running out. So, yeah, there's yet to see, but I'd still say Biden in a fairly strong position. Sorry, what were you going to say? What the other two things?
I was going to say there's two more things on 538 that I'd point people to. One is kind of following on from that point. There is still a path for Trump to victory. So there's the election forecast, which has they've done a whole load of calculations, and they show it in a different, they show it in quite amusing again, these cartoon Biden and Trump heads. But it's currently saying Biden is favoured 87 in 100 times to win, Trump only winning 12 in 100 times, and then 1 out of 100 times being no electoral college majority. That's dipped a tiny bit from when it was 88 to 12 earlier in the week, but again, still looking very favourable for Biden. So I'll put that link in the show notes. And the other thing that has now launched, which is fun to play with, and I'm sure kind of thing Rob will enjoy playing with, you can now explore the ways that the two candidates could win the election by playing around with the key states, the swing states, and all of that on an interactive map. So you can kind of build your own little prediction based on what you might think. Like, you might think you're pretty certain about a particular state if you know people there, or if you've just read a lot about it. So you can have a play with that and see what happens to the model, and that's always interesting to do as well. So I'll leave all those links in the show notes. As always, thank you for coming along and listening to us. You can find us in all the usual places, on our website at parliamentary.observer, on Reddit /r/unparliamentary, on Instagram and Twitter at unparlpodcast, and on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. As we always ask you, if you like the show, you can either go to patreon.com/TTSS and give us some of your cold, hard cash in return for us continuing to make this podcast and to keep our show on the air. Or, of course, it always helps if you spread the word, tell someone that you enjoy this podcast, you enjoy our insights and maybe our amusing banter, and so send them our way. More listeners is always good. Thank you as always for joining us. And I think there's nothing else left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him. Bye.
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 Bye. Bye. Bye.